If you've been wondering what dub poetry is all about, well, here is your chance to get it straight from the source. Dub poetry, a conversation with Mutabaruka. That's our topic on today's edition of Carib Nation. Don't go anywhere. Carib Nation is up next.
By the Bible or the gun, any which way, freedom must come. By the ballot or the bullet, by the Bible or the gun, any which way, freedom must come. In El Salvador, by the ballot or the bullet, by the Bible or the gun, any which way, freedom must come. By the ballot or the bullet, by the Bible or the gun, any which way, freedom must come. In South Africa, by the ballot or the bullet, by the Bible or the gun, any which way, freedom must come. By the ballot or the bullet, by the Bible or the gun, any which way, freedom must come. In South Africa.
Welcome to Carib Nation. I'm David Hines. When we talk about Caribbean artists and Caribbean culture, we think of our calypsonians and reggae singers and our novelists. Well, there is an art form in the Caribbean that's called dub poetry. Some people define it as poetry, synchronizing with music, especially with reggae music. Well, you'll have a chance today to find out what dub poetry is all about. Is it an intrinsically Caribbean phenomenon? Is it an African phenomenon? We'll find out all of that in today's edition of Carib Nation. I have with me in the studio one of the pioneers in dub poetry, Mutabaruka.
Yeah, man, give thanks.
Welcome to Carib Nation. I have been following your work since the 1970s when I first came across your poetry, and I think at that time my sense was that dub poetry was a new phenomenon in the Caribbean cultural mix. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, well, it started, actually the words to the rhythm started in the 70s, but I have been writing poems from in the 60s in school, you know. It wasn't until 1981 that I actually did put a poem to music. But there's a virgin by the name of Linton Kwesi Johnson.
Exactly.
He was recording the poems from in the 70s. He fused the poetry with reggae rhythms. I think this phrase, dub poetry, was kind out of, you know, the drum and the bass, you know, the raw rhythm of the reggae was the drum and the bass, and the poets say the poems to the drum and the bass like the DJs of that time. But now the music is so intense and it's so wide now that the drum and the bass is no longer just the main theme of the music in dub poetry. You know, we use any music that is necessary to bring across what we are expressing in the music, you know, in the poetry.
Let's go back to the beginning. You obviously are Jamaican, Caribbean, coming up in the Caribbean, or
African born in Jamaica.
African born in Jamaica, the Caribbean. And of course, it is known that in the Caribbean, everybody wanted, or still wants, their children to be doctors and lawyers and so on. And you chose to be a poet. Why?
Well, it's not really I choose it. It come like it choose me actually, because I used to go to school to study electronics. You know, when I left school, I was working in the electrical field. You know, but you know, over that time, you started to get frustrated with the 9-to-5 work. You know, you have no time for yourself. But during that course of time, we were writing poems. You know, I used to write the poems and put it down. You know. I didn't actually publish one until going to leave school. I was asked to put a poem in one of our very popular magazines in Jamaica. And when I put that poem in the magazine, there was, you know, reasoning going on about the poem, and the publisher asked me to keep putting poems in the magazine, and out of that, putting the poems in the magazine, he started to get people saying that, yeah, it's a good thing, you know. So he published the first book of poetry, Outcry. At that time, there was no, that kind of poem was not published in Jamaica. It was more social, you know, social, political, religious kind of poems, and the book was big.
And that was what year?
That was 1971.
1971, 72.
Yeah, but we never used to record them. We just saying them.
You're just saying them?
Yeah, orally saying them. And after that, we started to perform the poems, and then we did our next book in the late 70s. The first poems. It was a compilation of all the poems that I ever did publish in different magazines into one book, you know. And then in 1981, I recorded the first poem, Every Time I Hear the Sound, and that was the first time a poem with music ever entered the pop charts in Jamaica. So that started a whole different level of thinking towards dub poetry and what dub poetry mean, you know.
As a youngster growing up in Jamaica in the 1960s, at a time when young Jamaicans, when they think about getting into the business of the arts, they would get into reggae singing and so on. But poetry, you got into poetry.
Yeah.
Why?
Because poetry, to me, I could express what I felt in the poem, and I couldn't sing, you know. And at that time in the 60s, it was the Black Power movement, you know. Yeah. The Black Power was the cry, you know. You had man like Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, Huey, you know, all the things that lend itself to revolution in the 60s, you know. And as a youth coming up, we used to read all of these poems, all of these books, really. And plus, we had teachers in the school that I used to attend. Marcus Garvey Jr., is Marcus Garvey's son, used to teach me in Kingston Technical. And we had others who used to have Malcolm X albums, you know, and we used to play the albums during lunchtime or after school, and the autobiography of Malcolm X, you know, reading these books influenced me a lot, you know. So out of that, reading and listening, you know, we start to express ourselves through poems. Then we look at the Black Power movement, and we see that the Black Power movement really was just a more social thing, you know. It was more a political thing. It never gave you a spiritual, enthusiastic consciousness, you know. And we know that African people really is not just political, we are also spiritual, you know. Well, Rastafari came in at that time, you know. Rastafari offered that blend and that balance between what was political and what was spiritual in Mutabaruka. So Rastafari was the outcome of all of that experience, and that writing now started to express from a Rastafari perspective what our view and what our perspective of life was, you know.
So would you say the influence of the Black Power movement, the Rastafari movement, played an important role in terms of shaping the manner in which you express yourself? Because note, your type of poetry was not the type of poetry that you learned at school. The kind of Keats and Wordsworth and that kind of thing.
Yeah, we used to learn those things and we shun it, you know, because, you know, we were taught in school that to speak properly is to speak in English, standard English, and most Jamaicans speak the Jamaican dialect that they call patois, but we don't write it.
So your kind of poetry more is a rejection of the Eurocentric idea of what poetry is all about.
Not
and
only
a formation of the African and the Caribbean.
Yeah, it is also understanding who we are as a people and how the environment that we live in shape our ideas and our outlook and life as African people dispersed and, you know, displaced in the Caribbean. You know.
Johnny was a singer in Jamaica. Say him want to make it in America. So him check out the embassy and get a visa. Next day, Johnny flying on Air Jamaica. Now Johnny left him Queens and New York scene. Start to live the American dream. Johnny was starting to do quite well. Underestimated that the concrete hell. He meet a white thing, settle in a Brooklyn. Little more Johnny was previous in. Johnny looking better in a New York. End up sipping coke in a Central Park. Now Johnny out of work. Him really get broke. Him run out of luck. Poor Johnny. Johnny never want no ganja pe puff. Cause him said smoking wasn't enough. So him start check out 42nd Street. Where all the drunk heads meet to cheat. Yes, Johnny looking better in a New York. End up sipping coke in a Central Park. Now Johnny out of work. Him really get broke. Him run out of luck. Poor Johnny.
You deal with a lot of Africanist themes, if I may use that
Yes.
term, Africanist themes in your work. The whole question of African culture and Africa and the oneness of Africans. Talk a little bit about what motivates you to deal with such issues. And of course, when you began to deal with such issues, you obviously must have been aware that they weren't quote-unquote popular issues, certainly not in the art world, and certainly not in the political environment in Jamaica at that time.
Well, when you start to gather information, you see, information is very important, especially to black people right now, you know. Information was taken away from us. Information is hidden from us, you know. But when you start to be alternative, you start to look other than what you are taught in school, you know, like, for instance, we were taught Shakespeare, so we stopped read Shakespeare, you know, we start to read, we start to find out if there are really any people in Africa that write. When I used to go to school, I never know that you have African people who write. I never know you have to have Caribbean people that write. I used to hear about Claude McKay. I didn't know that Claude McKay was from the Caribbean. I thought Claude McKay was from America, you know. And you start to realize that, but wait, black people write. You know, we hear this thing about African people being oral. You get this impression that African people never used to write nothing. You know, we just speak things, and in saying these things, you realize that when the first man say it, the last man don't say it back the same way. So it's not reliable. At least we were taught that these things, ears are not reliable. But really we find out that African people used to write, and you have a lot of so much Caribbean literature that is not being taught in the school. You have so much black literature from Africa that is not taught in school. It was our aim and view now to go out there now and search for ourselves. You know, so one of the things is like they say, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you. That is what was our intention, to seek and find. And in finding, we find Africa. And we see that our whole being, the way we behave, our understanding of life, started to take this African-centered perspective, you know, and we from that till now, we have been there, you know.
When you first started in the late 60s, early 70s, doing this kind of dub poetry and African-centered poetry, what was the response by the ordinary Jamaicans?
The ordinary Jamaican listen to you. It's just that now the problem is with the people who shun what the ordinary people have to express. You know, there's a woman in Jamaica by the name of Miss Louise Bennett.
Louise Bennett, right.
Yeah, Miss Louise Bennett was the first woman, the first poet, as a matter of fact, to actually use the language of the people to express the feelings of the people in literature. And 50 years ago when Miss Louise Bennett started to do this thing, it was like disgusting. Not to the people, but to the system, you know. How can you go on a stage and speak like a market woman? You know, what manner of woman is this? Expressing herself like how a market woman would express themselves. But now we see that this is now accepted as a part of the Jamaican culture, the Jamaican literature, that Miss Louise Bennett has carried the folklore of Jamaica and the language of the people to heights that now you can just sit and just talk normal in Jamaica and people don't believe that you're unintelligent. Because that was what they used to say. When you speak Jamaican dialect, you're unintelligent. You know, I mean, intelligent people don't talk that way.
Jamaican and Caribbean dub poet Mutabaruka in the studio here with us today. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation. We'll talk a little bit about Mutabaruka's journey through the world as he took Jamaican language and Jamaican culture to the rest of the world. Don't go anywhere. Carib Nation will be right back.
Mandela, beware, mind your sheer out with sheer. Mandela, beware, over 400 years, them not here. It's not good to stay in a white man country too long.
Welcome back to Carib Nation. Today we're taking a look at art and culture in the Caribbean, in particular dub poetry. Muta, your name.
Yeah,
I read that you changed your name from your European name to your African name after reading something by a Rwandan poet.
A Rwandan poet named Jean-Baptiste Mutabaruka. You know, I was in school and we had this poetry book, you know, I was going through it. And I wrote a poem about the drum, you know, and I was reading this poem about a drum, you know, and the poem was, it's almost like I was reading his poem, or he was reading my poem, you know. And the name struck me, you know, Mutabaruka, you know, so I took the name Mutabaruka, and it was not till years after I went to Paris and I met some Rwandans, and they say, I thought you was a Rwandan, you know. So I said, no, I'm a Jamaican, and they say, if I know what Mutabaruka name mean? I said, no, but I like the name out of a book. He said, so the Mutabaruka mean one who is always victorious. You know,
yes.
So I said, yeah, that's a good name there, you know, I'm glad that I took that name. So it has stuck since that, Mutabaruka.
And certainly you were part of a trend in the Caribbean that came out of the Black Power movement, where Caribbean people began to shed their European names, as they said in those days, the slave names, and to take on African names as an affirmation of our Africanness.
Yes.
Muta, you have traveled all over the world, carrying the culture, carrying the message to people, African people, black people, non-African people, but spreading the word. What has been your response? What has been the response to you from blacks in the diaspora, here in North America and in England in particular?
Well, it is good, you know. Black people respond, Europeans respond too. We find that sometimes when there's a mixed crowd and you talk about, you affirm your Africanness, it is the black people in the audience that feel embarrassed about it, you know, like, you know, you will be talking about what Europeans did in history, and black people seem to be squinching, you know, like, how could you say that, you know, like, we have so much poems that we talk, and we say it out, you know, forthrightly, and we get this response that, you know, you can't say that, you know, or you could have said, you know, white people in the audience, you know, them kind of way there. But we take the attitude that we don't care, you know. I mean, we're saying what we feel, and you feels it, knows it, and we express it like we come to it. So we don't have no, we are prettying it up to make it palatable to the listener, you know. I mean, you take it as it is. If you can't take it, you leave it.
Why do you think our people respond in that way?
Because we have this complex about who we are as a people, as African people, you know. You still hear people in Jamaica cuss people about them black and ugly. You know, you still hear people say, well, I'm here nice, you see, it's straight, you know, and him nose not so big. You know, you still hear people that. So we have a complex. So when you affirm, you reaffirm this African thing, you know, people say, have this feeling, you know, like, wow, you know, you really say that, you know. And part of your task as an artist is to break down that kind of yeah,
thing.
man. I feel like the artist, you see, African art was never abstract. You see, what we see now, we see abstract art, where you look at a painting and you don't know what it is all about. You know, African, when you look at a thing, you know what it is talking about. When the griot speak, you know exactly what he's speaking about. You know. We reach a stage now of abstract, you know, where you say things but it's not that you mean. And when somebody interprets it, you say, oh, you could have interpreted it that way. You know, so it's almost like a hypocritical thing coming. Now, the artist must use his art to express the feeling of the people. And I feel that an artist must awaken the conscience and the consciousness of the people. That is the purpose of art.
You said two things there. That the artist must be able to mirror what is going on among the people, but also at the same time to awaken
the conscience and the consciousness.
So you think there is a dual role for the artist?
Yeah, I don't think that artists must be placed in the position that you say, well, I must change this and I must change that.
Okay.
I think the artist can only show you what everything is all about. You is the one who must dig into yourself and find the solution for the problem. You know, I can show a man a problem in America and I can show the man the same problem in England. But maybe the solution for these problems is not the same. You know, maybe communism can work in Russia, but it can't work in America. Maybe Christianity can work in England, but it can't work in Iran.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so even though we might be talking about politics, but the way is different. So the artist can only now express his attitude and his feelings towards what is happening. But it is up to the person who is listening or viewing to take it to himself. That is why we talk about awakening the conscience and the consciousness of the people. When we talk to white people, it's really the conscience we talk to. When we talk to black people, it's the consciousness we're talking to. You know, so it is up to them now to take the poems and farm it in themselves and bring out this. You know, most people, when you start them, say, so what is the solution? You know, I'm not here to tell people them solution. That it will be now impeding on them sovereignty and them right to understand based upon of them environment, you know.
How has Rastafari influenced you both as an artist and as a person?
Rastafari is I. Rastafari is I. That is what we live, you know. And some people argue that Rastafari also, sometimes we hear people say Rastafari is sexist. Rastafari is sexist because of the same Judeo-Christian ideas that a lot of Rastafarians still uphold and maintain, you know. And unless we move away from these Judeo-Christian ideas and concepts and return to our African-centered ideas. Before the Arabs, before the Christians came to Africa, we were very matriarchal in our understanding, you know. African was never talking about God as he. We were talking about she. You know, most of the things that, you know, you can see the mother nature. The mother nature concept come out of so-called primitive thinkers, primitive men, you know. And we adapt this Judeo-Christian concept so much to the point where now we shift the strength of our being that is supposed to be the feminine in us to this masculine concept that is industrializing the whole world, you know. When we were matriarchal, we was nearer to the earth. You know, when we were matriarchal, we understand women more. But we move from the earth and start to cover the earth with concrete and asphalt and steel. So we become patriarchal. And in that patriarchal consciousness now, we start to believe that we are it, not understanding that it is because of the womb of the woman that we exist as we are, you know.
Let's talk about some people. Bob Marley.
Yeah.
Is influence on you, if any? Is influence on
No,
Jamaican
Bob Marley never
Caribbean?
influenced. I was a Rasta before I started listening to reggae music.
Okay.
You know, reggae music never influenced me. You know, it's my way of life influenced me, you know. So I wasn't really influenced by Bob Marley as such, you know. But Bob Marley is, to me, one of the greatest black man to rise up out of the Caribbean. You know, if we was talking about great black men, we'd have talked about Marcus Garvey, you know, Bob Marley, Stokely Carmichael.
Come into them. Yeah.
So it's like Bob Marley to me is in that category.
Is in that category.
Yeah.
Marcus Garvey.
Marcus Garvey is greater than Jesus to me because Marcus Garvey has done what Jesus could not do in unifying black people's mind and consciousness. And if it wasn't for Rome, Jesus wouldn't be so popular. But Marcus Garvey is popular because of black people understanding about who and what they are supposed to be. So if a man to tell me to choose between Jesus and Marcus Garvey, I'd choose Marcus Garvey.
Hail Selassie, and I left that for last because...
Hail Selassie is the Almighty. Hail Selassie is that consciousness that has carried us through over the years as a Rastafari, you know, Haile Selassie is what we or they would say is Christ. And we say it's Christ, not seeing Christ as a man, but Christ as an attitude and a way. And we see that way in Haile Selassie.
There are lots of criticisms of Haile Selassie.
Yeah, it depends on which side of the fence you're looking at.
Nepotism, and he's being a kind of a despot. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It depends on which side of the fence you're looking at, you know, and we will not deter from our connection between our past and what is now. That we were fed a religious belief that was not African, and the Rastaman has found Christ in an African. The Rastafari is the only indigenous religion to black people in the Caribbean and in the Western world here. We have fashioned God in our own image, according to Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey said, if the white man want to worship God through his own spectacle, let him do it. If the Jews want to see the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob, let him do it. But we shall worship God through Ethiopia. And that is what the call of the Rastaman, worshiping God through Ethiopia. And we see Haile Selassie as that force, that spirit that has kept history intact from before Adam and Eve until now.
To those non-black people and black people who say today that as black people we ought not to harp on the past, we ought not to harp on slavery, what is this whole thing about blackness, we're all of one human race, there is no racism about, what would you say to them?
Them living in illusion. Them living in fantasies. There's nothing without the past. We're not harping on the past. We're just bringing the past to light. You know, this no more darkness. You know, the past was a darkness. The Jews talk about the past. The Jews talk about Moses' favor and ever, amen. We're not talking about so far. We're just talking about 500 years ago. You know, the Jews talk about something that happened. I mean, that happened 3,000 years ago, so they was in bondage in Egypt. You know, we're talking about just 500 years ago.
Mutabaruka,
yeah, man,
it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Give away in pride and dignity, trying to act cool, playing the fool. Yes, Johnny looking better in a New York. End up sipping coke in a Central Park. Now Johnny out of work, him really get broke. Him run out of luck. Poor Johnny.